Hello and welcome to the Culture Orientations Approach webinar. We are realizing strategic performance in a VUCA world today. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to introduce not only myself but my fellow panelists on the call today. So my name is Lynne. I'm the Director of Global Leadership Solutions at TMC, a Berlitz company. And my fellow panelists and authors of the 6th edition of the Cultural Orientations Guide are Joerg Schmidt and Karen Walch. Can we say a quick hello, Joerg and Karen?
Absolutely. Hello to everyone, and thanks for joining us today.
And Karen, I think you might be on mute.
Greetings from Arizona, everybody. I'm happy that you're all here.
Super, thanks. Well, we're excited to present to you some thoughts about the Cultural Orientations Approach, which is the certification program that is designed and developed by TMC. So let's get started. We have a couple of housekeeping items to go through here real quick. In order to keep the background noise reduced during the presentation, everyone will be on mute. So please use the question and answer box on the bottom right to correspond with us. We will answer as we go, or we will save those until the end of the presentation, and before the end of the hour we will address your question. We are recording today's session, and after the webinar we'll share the link with the attendees and we will post it on tmcorp.com, our corporate website. And sometimes when we switch presenters you may see a pause in the presentation or the audio, so please bear with us. We will continue just as quickly as possible. All right, so let's just see what we're doing today in terms of objectives. We hope to introduce the Cultural Orientations Approach and its differentiators to you. We're really focused on discussing challenges to achieving strategic performance, and we specifically use the VUCA world concept, which is the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous global environment that we find ourselves in. And we present a comprehensive cultural perspective in order to achieve that strategic performance. And we move into really reviewing the critical mindset and skills that are required in order to achieve that strategic performance. And we'll illustrate some practical applications for realizing inclusion and strategic performance by the time we're done. We have our first poll just to find out who's on the line with us today. And we're wondering what your organizational role is within your company. Is it talent management, organizational development, training, business line leader, or other? Go ahead and use the radio button to let us know. And let's see who's on the line. Oh, interesting. If you have other, go ahead and type your role into the question box. That will help us understand who is on the line with us and what interest you have in the Cultural Orientations Approach and the Cultural Orientations Guide. So I am joined by Karen and Joerg, and we will trade off in this presentation and have kind of a conversation to help illustrate and bring this content to life. So I want to introduce Karen at this time and have her just walk us through the strategic performance framework. So let me hand it off to Karen.
Thank you, Lynn. As Lynn's already pointed out, part of the new version of the Cultural Orientations Approach, we've developed this model, which is the result of all the years all three of us have worked in the cultural competence space. And what we've done is to look at the way that all of these various dimensions are linked. So, for example, you will note that it is a continuous loop, and we've developed an affinity diagram to show how these things are continually fed upon each other and enhanced as time goes on. But if we needed to take a very linear approach, we would say that any of us that have to enhance our interpersonal communication or have to influence others or negotiate with others or are in leadership positions where we need to actually develop others and ourselves, that first component is that self-awareness and that open attitude of curiosity and tolerance, which leads us then to understand others and then to develop an understanding of insight, which basically has a shift in our mindset in the way we look at ourselves, what is expected, reinforced for ourselves, and we learn a little bit about others, which helps us then with the key cultural skills of style switching, cultural mentoring, cultural dialogue, and cultural due diligence, which we will spend a little more time looking specifically at these skills. But we have found in our research and in our work that these key cultural skills are critical between that element of awareness and insight to the actual behavior and practices which lead to strategic and leadership results. So for example, with the skill of style switching, there is an increased opportunity to influence those who are very different than we are. It also increases and develops a contagion of others to collaborate and to negotiate and share information in a communication process that actually increases opportunities in creativity and innovation. And of course, once we learn the skills and we apply the skills, there will always be continual insight about ourselves and others, which leads to an increased enhanced human performance and organizational performance. So this is the strategic model that we would like to look at as we talk about the cultural orientations approach in a much more comprehensive today, as we may have done in the past. So let's take one quick poll question here. We have a new poll which we would like to ask you briefly here to get your feedback. Which of the following is a priority for enhancing your organizational strategic performance? Here are a few options. Enhancing interpersonal communication, influencing across a matrix environment, strengthening cross-border negotiation skills, improving team collaboration, or achieving merger and acquisition or JV synergies. Select one of these to give us a sense of what are some of the challenges that you have noticed in the work that requires these kinds of cultural skills and these strategic performance skills. So we'll see that we're evenly mixed here, enhancing interpersonal communication for 50% of us and improving team collaboration, another 50% of us, highlights what we have seen in our work, that there's something about moving from the personal awareness and insight to actually developing particular cultural competencies and skills which impact our strategic and leadership performance around negotiation, communication, and influence. So, Joerg, I'd like to just check in with you and Lynne. Anything else you'd like to say about the general new framework we have before you explore the cultural orientations approach?
No, I think from my perspective, I think this was a great summary, and I think the critical piece to what you said, Karen, is actually that the four skills that TMC has historically really highlighted and focused on are really somewhere in between what people are trying to accomplish, right? Collaborate better, negotiate better, communicate better, and they're not always top of mind, right? People come to us and say, I want to improve my relationships, but we oftentimes from our work know, okay, so in order to do that, we really need to work on those other parts of this model, and I think that's the strength of this approach, to help people realize that communicating better relies on other things to be in place, so there are other levels of causality that we are addressing here. And maybe that links
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, excellent. I agree with what you said, Joerg, and I truly think that the linkage between these is really important in order to build up to, you know, successful negotiations. For instance, when you sit at the table across from, you know, the colleague that you're negotiating with to get the best price, to provide the services and support that you're looking to provide. So, Joerg, you had another comment.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to link it to this whole this slide that we're looking at right now. What exactly is the cultural orientations approach? And I think what we just said is actually really important to that we have basically taken what we know to be true from practical experience from our work, and also what we know to be true from a lot of research, and articulated it, right? Put it into a comprehensive system that we've, in a certain sense, always used, but never made quite as explicit as it is here. So it's really a comprehensive system that is well-grounded as a methodology to develop cultural competency, which is what stands right behind what most people think about when they think, oh, I need to improve my intercultural skill sets, because they are experiencing that something isn't working in their relationships, but they're not really thinking, ooh, I'm not doing style switching. That's not an instinctive you know, leap, but we help people see the connections. So this is a comprehensive system that combines an online platform, as many people know, the Cultural Navigator, a suite of learning solutions, and through skilled, certified internal practitioners oftentimes in an organization to help bring the system come to life and travel to the places where the impact is most needed in an organization. And of course, it's built upon really well-established understandings of cultural differences that make linkages to a lot of the current insights in emotional intelligence, the discoveries in neuroscience. So it has broad application and links to the current topics. The problems it solves, and I think that's what we're talking about too, is that we are solving problems at the organization level, right? In that we are helping organizations create and internalize a response system to the type of challenges that arise in a global intercultural environment. We are helping teams and to create more inclusive processes by doing so. And we are really helping leaders to focus on the cultural aspects of performance. So there is an individual connection there as well, particularly, of course, when we focus on these issues around VUCA that you introduced, Lynne, earlier, around volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And maybe, Karen, I know you've done a lot of work with the concept of VUCA. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? And I think it's interesting to think about VUCA in the context of your work in the areas of social neuroscience.
Yes, this concept of VUCA comes from the leadership and strategy work in the military after the Cold War. And a lot of the war colleges have been studying the fundamental concept of leadership post-Cold War, and then moving past 9/11, and even more importantly now as we go through these major global shifts. And the concept here is to really look at this notion of leadership, especially very hierarchical control and command, in a very uncertain and volatile situation. Because during this very complex time in our global history, the nature and the speed and the magnitude of the dynamics of change, the volatility, is in fact much more severe, and the recovery time is much shorter. So this is going to impact command and control types of leadership. In addition, the lack of predictability of the events that we've seen in the global environment impact us both at the government level and at the private sector level. And the notion of complexity, the kind of confounding of issues, the chaos surrounding organizations, has made it very difficult to be able to have the ultimate leader design both the strategy and the tactics in any kind of organizational design. So there's a real questioning of strategy and leadership where we have more of a vision developed by your ultimate leader, and those who are in charge of the enterprise will actually provide the freedom and the creativity for subordinate leaders to actually plan and execute these plans. And in the context of so much ambiguity and haziness, and there's mixed meanings, where this has impact in terms of neuroscience is that we're finding that this global period of cultural shift and rapid change has enormous impact on the human nervous system. And this kind of novelty, to have to always be looking at something new, to behaving in a particular way, has impact on how our brains work. And the interesting work we find in neuroscience is just around the hormonal and the neural pathway fritzing that can happen when we are asked to perform and to provide answers in these kind of volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous situations. So what we have found is with these tools of the cultural orientation approach, it helps individuals learn what their vision is, the antidote to volatility. It, on terms of uncertainty, understanding of ourselves, cultural insights about others, helps us with the kind of clarity we need, clarity which would be the antidote to complexity, of how I'm going to behave in a very ambiguous market, which basically means I am able to be much more agile. I am able to style switch, to step to the other party's side, to understand their needs and interests. So this is where we find the key cultural skills help with what we call VUCA prime, to develop vision and understanding and clarity and agility.
It's really interesting that on one hand VUCA describes a macro context, right, and it lives right in our own nervous system. So it resides even when I'm looking at my inbox sometimes, right? But I think it's something we can all recognize in a sense. And if we go to the next slide for a moment, because one dimension of the VUCA reality is something that we all, I think, can relate to. If it's not in your inbox, and if you can't relate to VUCA as a kind of an assault on your personal nervous system, this is certainly an example of a radically shifting reality that we are experiencing right now. Not that these periods haven't been part of human history before, but we are all experiencing a radical shift in when you think about just population growth and representation by region, and how that even translates into a cultural context and cultural shifts that we can expect to happen and see in the world today. So I don't think we need to belabor this particular graph, but I think it exemplifies a number of really important trends. Out of that, I mean, just to quickly share this context, TMC has certainly over the years adapted its approach to intercultural effectiveness to the shifting demographic realities, the shifting awareness of the VUCA realities, recognizing full well that the cultural questions and the cultural challenges don't reside anymore as they did in the kind of early 80s or so in the internationalization of business. The internationalization certainly brought about this really interesting view and attention to cultural differences, which we captured early on in the cultural orientations model and other things that TMC had developed. But it really progressed rather rapidly over this time span from there through a phase of globalization, through an emergence of the topic of diversity and multiculturalism in many organizations, to now and much more recently this idea of strategic performance. And I think in response to these changing environmental conditions, the changing organizational challenges, we also extended and expanded the solutions and the tools that TMC provides to become an approach to handling a variety of different aspects of culture that resides at the national, individual, identity, group, team, organization, and functional level. So I think that's what we were trying to articulate in this slide here, to just understand that we have progressed and evolved an entire suite of tools over the years to be current and relevant to the evolving conversations in organizations in this type of VUCA world. I think importantly, and I mentioned this very briefly, is actually the idea that culture exists on a number of different levels as a phenomenon, as a phenomenon that happens when we operate as human beings in groups. So very often it's very tempting to think of culture as a difference between nationality, perhaps. But when you just look at this phenomenon of culture a little more closely, we may actually discover that nationality is only one, and perhaps not even the best way of framing cultural differences. So we certainly recognize that it exists at national levels. It also exists at functional levels. It exists at identity group levels, certainly. It exists at organizational levels. Within individuals, and certainly at the team level. And so all of these aspects and dimensions of culture need to be recognized. And I think a very powerful way of doing that is actually by saying we can, in one approach to culture, actually create conversations, develop skills, and offer solutions that recognize that the challenges come about from any different type of level of culture. So any of these 6 levels can contribute to a specific challenge, and we need an approach, and we have an approach that can address these challenges at those levels. But of course, the first starting point is to analyze it and diagnose it through these 6 levels of culture from the very beginning. So I guess the question is, what is culture, right, in this context? And one way of looking at it may be just the association. We've looked at it as a pattern of association between behavior, cognition, and beliefs and behaviors that tend to be expected, reinforced, rewarded by, and within a particular group. And that's, I think, a mouthful on some levels, but it's probably more simply expressed as what is expected, reinforced, and rewarded and within a particular group. This actually would be not only a definition that does justice and can apply at all these 6 levels, but it also gives us an analytic lens through which we can identify and map, if you will, the differences between norms and values, the connections that exists for people and group between behavior, beliefs, content of those beliefs. And if we can analyze culture from that lens and apply it to any of these 6 levels, we actually have a very powerful entry point in understanding and mapping cultural differences. And that understanding, by the way, is very, I mean, it's almost built as an anthropological understanding of that difference. So Lynne, do you want to talk about the cultural perspective a little bit?
I'd love to, Joerg. Thanks for that. So as Joerg and Karen have both identified, that cultural perspective really emerges from a process of self-discovery and mindfulness that we bring to the work that we do every day. And we propose that it really begins with an open attitude, or an opportunity for us to evaluate what we're seeing and observing and experiencing with an open mind, without judgment, without a framework that in any way evaluates good or bad, that it simply is, and to bring a mindfulness to that means that we are self-aware and we identify what our values are and what our belief systems are and how those influence our cultural perspective and our cultural preferences. And then the cultural preferences then are important on the individual level and as an internal reflection point, but equally important is the ability to identify others' cultural perspectives and others' approaches to situations that they may find more appropriate in their space and based on their experiences and their values and beliefs. And so being able to bring that open attitude not only to yourself and recognize your own preferences, but to others allows us to emerge with cultural insights and operate in your work environment without judgment, without right or wrong kind of framework around the cultural dynamics that you see within your organization. And so that leads us into really an understanding that self and other awareness is a very complex concept. And you know, the individual cultural profile definitely is at the core, but there are so many aspects that comprise who we are and how we show up in the workplace. And that inner circle of the wheel that we're showing you here is really, you know, based on your professional work, your professional experiences. Did you come from the corporate world? Did you come from the government world? Maybe the academic world? Where were you educated? What religion were you brought up in? And then the outer circle are some of the base components, right? Your host culture, your national culture, maybe your functional culture. The corporate culture as well influences who you are and how you show up in the workplace. And most importantly, your family culture influencing you from very little on. And so just representing the complexity of culture gets us into an idea of being able to recognize where stereotypes and generalizations meet and the difference between stereotypes and generalizations. So if you think of a stereotypical statement, it typically is without exception. It typically starts with all or none or everyone or no one, and it's a judgmental belief about a group or the members of a group, and it's thought to be accurate without allowing new information. Thus we use the closed door image for stereotypes. And we recommend that a culturally competent professional comes from a place of generalizations, where non-judgmental characterization of a group of people sounds like this. In my experience, working in India for 3 years and continuing to work now for 5 more years with India, I can say that the diversity is quite extensive within the multinational corporations that I have worked with in India. And so in my experience, I may be able to generalize some of the tendencies that I find, but recognizing that that's based on my experience and it's limited to my experience. So new information when it comes in is welcome. So the hypotheses that I craft based on my experience is not a fixed hypothesis. And so as we move towards cultural competence, we want to keep in mind that framework of generalizations and being able to represent, you know, the observations and your experiences within my exam. In my experience or when I've worked with them, this is what I've observed. And that gets us from, you know, a concept of ethnocentrism to ethnorelativism. You see the arrows are moving from the orange all the way over to the green. And this is really a measure of how much we relate to others. And so that ethnocentrism orange block really is an indicator of centricity around your own cultural perspective. And so you evaluate others in that ethnocentrist mindset You evaluate others based on what you experience and based on what you were born and brought up with, and what your world basically informs in terms of the workplace environment. And we want to move to an ethno-relativist perspective, which is the area of the green, where our perspective on culture is relative to the situations that we find ourselves in. And so, for instance, again, when I moved to India for 3 years, my relative perspective changed significantly. And my perspective was that of an Indian environment that I found myself in. And so I evaluated situations and observed behaviors based on what I knew to be true about the Indian context. Now, being a complex culture that India is, I still don't necessarily have a very clear understanding of the culture, and certainly wouldn't put myself at integration, which is the very, very far right perspective as it relates to how we view you know, your relationship to another culture. But I would say I was pretty clearly into adaptation by the time I left that nation, living in that nation. So think of the ethnocentrism and ethno-relativism span as kind of a measurement for yourself, and maybe evaluating others as well in terms of where they are as they relate to another culture. And this gets us, again, into a space of cultural competence development. So also moves us very easily into the cultural skills, and moves us to a space that is really quite a robust area of skill building. It typically starts with a cultural due diligence, which is our research and development around the cultural aspects that we're going to engage with, and being, you know, kind of prepared for the environment that we're going to step into. And it quickly moves to a decision-making point. If I feel that my counterpart is not necessarily open or interested in adapting their style, then I might use a different behavioral approach. I might present myself with a style that is not necessarily in line with my style. And on the other side, if my counterpart is interested in cultural dialogue and is something that is exciting for them to engage in terms of exploring those differences, then I'm going to engage in cultural dialogue and have a discussion about, you know, how do you operate here most effectively? And being able to exchange that information is part of that relationship building, and certainly moves us into a space of cultural competence. And then the last phase of this key cultural skill building then informs the rest of these other three stages of skill building, and that is cultural mentoring. And not only is it mentoring others, but also knowing when to seek out a mentor for yourself. And that might be someone who's younger than you that has a skill set that you don't have, for instance, social media. I have sought out social media mentors myself who happen to be of a different generation than myself. I might offer my mentoring to someone who is looking for organizational mentoring, who's maybe new to my organization and wants to understand the culture. And so those are the 4 key cultural skills. I wonder, Joerg, do you have any thoughts about you wanted to contribute?
Yeah, I'm just wondering that, you know, in your earlier example, you mentioned, I mean, that you lived extensively in India for some time in order to really develop a more ethno-relative perspective. And it's easier probably, or relatively easy. I mean, it's never easy to develop this skill and these skills, but it's probably relatively more easy if you are immersed in that different culture, move there, live there, and work there day in, day out. The reality, of course, in most organizations today, the global, international, multinational organizations, happens to be that people don't expatriate as much as they even used to in the 90s or early parts of this millennium. There is much less of the physical movement and much more of the virtual connectivity, so that in essence we can easily underestimate or overlook the existence of cultural differences, which we wouldn't be able to ignore if we lived there or worked there, right? So I think what I'm just trying to highlight is that these skills don't go away just because you don't travel or relocate. They're actually becoming more important, and however their need becomes less obvious perhaps, right? Even in an email, in a conference call, in so many different ways, we are in a sense virtual expatriates.
I hadn't really thought about a virtual expatriate before, Joerg. That's a fantastic concept, and certainly something that still requires the cultural competence that we're talking about here, although in a different environment, right, and different skill sets required for that virtual space as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Also, I'd like to comment on that. Not only is it virtual, but even if we stay domestic, because of the globalization and the movement of multiculturalism and diversity, we have to do this in our domestic environment because of the fact of globalization today.
That's a great point, actually. I think that's so true. So in other words, we are increasingly in this world challenged to almost use this as a continuous cycle, right? Continuously engaging in cultural due diligence, not assuming that the way that I am likely to approach a situation is going to be successful in this, with this person, in this context, that I need to look for how do I need to style switch, maybe use cultural dialogue, act as a cultural mentor, or look for a cultural mentor. I mean, that has to almost be an instinctive skill set, right, that we are developing.
Yes, and this is exactly where, as you've shown in our historical movement on this, why it's so critical that this is a part of the diversity and inclusion initiatives. Exactly these reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we are looking at this slide around cultural due diligence at the moment, and I think what is really important in that context is that, as you, I mean, Karen, you brought back this idea of evolution that we talked about earlier, that the cultural orientations model that TMC has developed and uses and functions oftentimes as a shared language that is research-based, and it's a shared language for cultural differences, of course. And I think that the power of this is, we shouldn't underestimate this, that organizations very often, especially if they need to build these skills, we need to anchor the conversations around cultural difference and even the skill building in some shared framework, in some shared understanding of those differences that organizations use. And that's precisely the role of the cultural orientations model, and also then all of the tools that support it, right? I think what is important is that we are looking at culture in this if the cultural orientations model serves at this lens, in three specific dimensions. And I think just in thinking about it, anybody who is connected can probably validate that this is a useful way of looking at how culture has conditioned us, in a sense. The one thing is how we see ourselves, how our sense of self was shaped by culture, and that's certainly a difference. How our thinking style has been shaped by culture, and then also how our interaction style, the way we interact and communicate, has been shaped by culture.
And that gets us really to the final stage of the strategic performance framework, which is strategic results. So as Joerg and you, Karen, have both identified, you know, the skill of influencing others without power, without proximity, without, you know, perhaps a shared historical perspective or cultural perspective, to be able to influence effectively, and especially in a matrix environment structure, which so many of our clients are working in. being able to have that agility to flow between cultural contexts that we operate in every day is critical, and that gets us to strategic results and collaboration that is meaningful and rewarding, negotiation that is successful, and specifically communication that allows us to flow between work processes, between organizational structures, new JV and merger and acquisition relationships that our organizations might require us to operate in, and more effectively our teams and the people we work with every day and care about. The ability for us to move into that really gets us to a couple of examples to help you, kind of understand the role of the strategic performance framework in day-to-day environment. So we have three different examples that we'd just like to highlight for you. Cross-functional collaboration, negotiating inclusive norms, and influencing in a global matrix. So perhaps let me hand it over to Joerg. Which one do you want to start with, Joerg?
Interesting. I mean, they're all kind of interesting. I think the one thing that I think is important, that when we work with clients and when we look at strategic performance and using everything we just talked about, organizations are doing that, and leaders are working with us in order to effect a tangible and measurable change, right? So, for example, I'll just take the first one here, the cross-functional collaboration. I mean, we talked about how culture exists at the functional level, and I mean, what we mean by function here is business unit, essentially. That's your, in a case like this, most likely to be your marketing function and your engineering function or your research function. And they are culturally very different from one another. And that difference can actually be mapped, recognized, described by the cultural orientations model, for example. And we can build very specific skills for individuals within this cross-functional environment. And obviously, organizations want to do this because they know that by creating better collaboration, cross-functional collaboration, they can achieve tangible outputs. And in this case, it was simply shortening the product development cycle, which is, in many industries, a real key driver of performance. Because if you don't hit that narrow window to market, you may be at a competitive disadvantage. So strengthening cross-functional collaboration was incredibly important here. And in this case, the case we just used, we essentially applied this cultural orientations approach to map the experiences and respective norms that existed within each function. We used cultural dialogue as part of an intervention to create a common and shared way of structuring and approaching the collaboration, and over time we're able to map how significantly this purposeful creation of a shared culture was positively linked to what the company cared about, namely the shortened product development cycles. So, I mean, Karen or Lynne, what maybe one of the other examples would be great.
Yeah, I can jump in here. This is Lynne. Really, the negotiating inclusive norms is a fantastic case study that helps us identify how, when we embed certified champions in this approach to culture and this approach to change within an organization, we're successful in creating an inclusive workplace. And specifically in this situation, we had an increased bid-win rate with our clients. So our client ran into a very difficult situation when they lost a multi-million-dollar deal in pre-sales, not even during the implementation. They couldn't even maintain the sale in the pre-sale process. So multi-million-dollar opportunity lost got the attention of the CEO. And the CEO and his senior leadership team wanted to effectively create an inclusive workplace where the engineers sitting down side by side in the pre-sale process would be able to communicate effectively without becoming polarized in their positions and creating a hostile environment where the negotiation went awry. And so what they did is a multi-stage, multi-year process. This is not something that was easy to change within the organization, but within 3 years they had a completely different mindset. And what they did was really focused on creating a common language. We've talked about the neutrality of the cultural orientations model language and lingo. And that effectively was done by really shifting from a regional mindset to a global cultural mindset and some cultural thinking that was inclusive of the members of the team that may not have shared the same similar background or similar thought processes. We effectively created a cadre or a group, a subgroup of the organization who were COA certified, and they became champions within the organization, and really crafted a local/global approach to the training and the facilitation that needed to happen within the organization at all levels. And so this, again, this group of champions within the organization worked across the globe through training, through intervention, through coaching, through really facilitating the results of individuals, COIs, of team norms, of organizational change initiative, and really in order to affect decreased cultural mishaps, which then impacted the bottom line, and we had an increase of the bid win rate. A couple of other anecdotal results of this was that there was an increase in that cultural dialogue across the organization and across the globe. So that what that looks like is on conference calls, it became a norm at this organization to have a check-in, to perhaps focus on a cultural perspective that someone was bringing to the function or to the project that they were working on, and allowed that exchange of ideas and exchange of cultural norms to happen, so that there was increased empathy, there was increased ability to style switch because we were wiser about the framework that people were bringing to their work style. And so really it provided an inclusive workplace as a whole, which had direct dollar impacts on the bottom line for this client that we worked with. So really negotiating those inclusive norms was only possible with a cadre of COA champions throughout and embedded throughout the organization.
And I think what also seems powerful is if you're building an internal cadre of skilled practitioners, you're not only making sure, that they're applying this knowledge base, but because they're internal, they can contextualize it in ways that an external consultant oftentimes couldn't or can't, which I think is very powerful. But it does probably require that long-term understanding by leadership as well, that that turnaround in a situation like that is not immediate, right? Like you said, it takes time for this to become cultural, and I guess organizations do need to understand and invest that time as well.
Yeah, and I'm going to suggest that we move into the last portion of the webinar so that we can get to some of the questions that we have before the top of the hour, if that's all right, Karen and Joerg.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Super. So let's just reflect on some key takeaways that we're hoping that we inspired within your own mindset. And if we could just get to the key takeaways 5, Akeisha, we'll just capture some of the key components around culture, that it's more than nationality or identity group. It's a phenomenon that occurs whenever we form and interact with groups. That it enables responsiveness to the forces of VUCA, which Karen really went deep into, and that neuroscience that really reveals the impact of the VUCA world on how we relate to others and how we react is really quite fascinating. That we really focus on elevating our cultural competence to achieve strategic performance results. And we've highlighted that it's a true process in order to achieve that, and we give you an example of a process that you might try. And that process includes the cultural orientations approach. And it's really a comprehensive certification system and academically grounded methodology to really develop the mind and skill sets of culturally competent leaders and managers and individual contributors, and a way to really institutionalize some adaptive management and business practices to create a multicultural, inclusive environment. And that's all housed in the Cultural Navigator and can be something that's truly value add and leveraged across the entire organization. So one more question for all of us on the line today, and that is, do you have cultural competence development embedded into your organizational system already? So just give us a quick indicator, yes or no, and if it's not that straightforward of an answer, go ahead and use the question box to help us understand it more. But let's see what our participants have said, Lakeisha. And most of us haven't seen a development within our organization. Thank you for that. And really that's what we're seeing on a regular basis with our clients, is that they're just tapping into this cultural competence as a foundational element to successful global business. And stick with us. We are continually talking about this with this free webinar series. In October, we're going to be talking about cultural competence, strategy implementation, and a balanced scorecard perspective. And go ahead and think about ordering the Cultural Orientations Guide, which is the book that your three hosts today have authored, a work of love. And we certainly would welcome a purchase of our book so you can have it on your bookshelf. And go ahead and explore the Cultural Navigator, and we have a marketing site that illustrates the value proposition of the Cultural Navigator. So we hope that you're able to check that out as well. We want to thank you for your time. Thank you, Joerg. Thank you, Karen. We'll move into question and answer period here for a brief moment, and maybe just a quick thank you and goodbye from all of us at TMC.